In this video, we're going to create a drone lander similar to this that has an articulating arm that will pick up an object. We'll be using polygon cubes, cylinders, and spheres to create the model, and IK kinematics to animate the arm that will pick up the object. In a new scene, I'll go to my top view, and I'll start by creating a polygon cube, dragging the footprint in the top view, and then going to the perspective view to give it some thickness. Now, throughout the video tutorial, these will be all subjective shapes based on your own take on this. Now I'm going to create the landing struts that would appear on each corner of the cube. I'll start once again in the top view, holding down my space bar, going to create polygon primitives, and I'll choose a cylinder. I'll drag a bit of a footprint for the circumference and return to the perspective view and give it some length. I'll now go to one of my orthographic views and I'll drag it down, and maybe I'll scale it to make it a little thinner. And now I'm going to put half of a polygon sphere at the bottom for a landing shoe. I'll go to the top view once again, and to create polygon primitives, this time I'll choose sphere and I'll drag it in the vicinity of the cylinder. Going to my orthographic view, front or side, I'll move down to the base of the cylinder, and I'll hit F on the keyboard to zoom in. Just for the tutorial, I'll reduce the subdivision width and height under Inputs to 10. Right-clicking on the sphere, I'll choose Face, and I'll select the bottom half and hit Delete on the keyboard. I'll return to the object mode, select it, delete by type history, center pivot, and freeze transforms. Now I want this to kind of fit right over the center of the cylinder. I'll go to my top view, and hitting F on the keyboard, I'll hit 4 so I can see through, and now I'll place it over the center of the cylinder that we created. Returning to one of my orthographic views, I'll rotate that cup a little bit so that when we rotate the landing strut at approximately a 45-degree angle, this will appear to be level with the axes in my viewport and on the surface of the planet. I'll shift select the cylinder and the half sphere, holding down the space bar, going to mesh and combine. Delete by type history, center pivot, and freeze transforms. I'll put the pivot at the top of the cylinder. Holding down D on the keyboard, I'll move it into position. I'm now going to put it in the corner of the cube. With one landing strut made, I know I need 3 others. Rather than texture all of them individually, I'm now going to apply a material to both pieces of geometry, and then as we proceed, we'll start to add that same texture to the new pieces. I'll marquee select both pieces of geometry, right-clicking and choosing Assigning New Material, AI Standard Surface, and I'll name it, and I'll put the checkerboard pattern on under the Create Render nodes. I'll hit 6 on the keyboard and I should see something like this. I'm going to place UV mapping on both the rectangle body as well as the leg. I'll start with the rectangle box that we're using for the body of the drone. Deleting type by history, freezing transform. Now I'll hold down the space bar with the cube body selected, going to UV, and I'll choose automatic. Returning to the object mode, I'll select my UV editor. And in the editor, I'll sew those pieces together. Right-clicking inside my viewport, I'll choose edge, and I'll select one of the edges. And I'll click on the Move and Sew. Now, if you don't see it on your dock, you can go to Cut and Sew. Move and Sew appears a second from the bottom. You can hold down Command and Shift and choose Cut and Sew, Move and Sew, and we'll put it on the dock above. I'll continue to do that till I have one collective UV shell. The keyboard quick is G on the keyboard if you choose to use it. I'll right-click, choose UV shell, and I'm going to put the checkerboard on so I can see where it is in relationship to it. As long as it's on the outside, there won't be a conflict as we add new shells to new pieces of geometry. I'll take a minute to scale this down a bit. I'll refine the scale once I have all the geometry made for the model. I'll return to the object mode in the viewport, and I'll select the landing strut, delete by type history, and freeze transforms. I'm going to use planar mapping on the x-axis. Holding down the space bar, UV, planar mapping, and I'll set it for X. Choosing apply, and in the channel box, making both projection width and height the same number. I'll start with 15, and when I return to my object mode and go to the UV editor, I should be seeing something similar to this. Because it's in the center of the checkerboard, I'll right-click and choose UV Shell. Marquee select both pieces, and hitting W, I'll move it outside the quadrant where the checkerboard is. Now I'm going to place the first strut and then generate 3 others. I'll start by putting in the lower corner on the right in the side view, and I'll go to the top view to make sure it's also inside the geometry there. Returning to my side view again, I'll hit E on the keyboard, and I'll just rotate that until the cup shape seems to be horizontal with the x-axis in my viewport. And you can imagine the planet below this landing strut of our little drone. Now I'll return again to the top view. In the top view, I need to generate 3 others, and I also want to rotate each of them so they're at 45-degree angles to the corners of the box body shape. Now, because I've moved that strut around, I'm going to freeze the transform each time I make a change so that I can make the change based on the new position. If I were to click on my y-axis and drag, I can see by looking in my channel box on the right that if I were to make my rotate y minus 45, I'd have the angle that I want. I'll hit W, and now I want to reflect another mirror image over to the corner at the bottom. And I'll click on Freeze Transforms. Now I'll go to Edit, Duplicate Special Attributes. And I need to reflect the copy over on the Z-axis. I'll go to Edit, Reset Settings. And in the Scale function, we have X, Y, and Z-axis from left to right. I'll need to put a minus sign in front of the one for the Z-axis and hit Return to set that number. And then when I click on Apply, I'll get a reflected copy. I'll drag that down to the lower corner of the box in the top view. Now I need to reflect over a mirror image of these two. I'll Shift select both and click on Freeze Transforms. And then again in my Duplicate Special options, I'll choose Edit Reset, and I'll put a minus sign, this time in front of the x-axis for scale. Hitting Return and hitting Apply, I'll drag the other 2 legs over to the other corners. In our perspective viewport, we should see something like this. Now we're going to create the propellers that will spin on top of our little drone that will allow it to fly. To start the propeller, I'll go to my top view. In my top view, holding down the space bar, I'll go to Create Polygon Primitives Cube, and I'll drag the footprint of the length of the prop I might want, and in the perspective view, I'll give it thickness. Now I want to extend a bit of a polygon off the edge on the left-hand side. So to do so, I'll select my edge loop and I'll split that in half. I'm going to zoom in on the edge. I'll right-click and choose Face, and I'll select the face at the very end. Clicking on my Extrude tool, I'll return to my top view, and I'll pull a bit of a rectangle out. I'll right-click and go back to my object mode. Now I know that should taper up on this top edge, so I'll right-click and choose Vertex, select the top vertices, and I'll hit R for scale, and I'll just taper it, and I'll return to my object mode. Now we're going to need 3 other of these as well, but I'm going to put the texture on before I proceed, so that once I texture this, all the others I generate from it will have the same UV map. With the geometry selected in any viewport, I'll right-click And down at the bottom of the material attributes, you'll see the option for assign existing material, and you'll see the name of the texture you've been using thus far on the drone model. If I hit 6 now, I should see that same checkerboard pattern on all the geometry. I'm now going to hit W, and I'll move the pivot, holding D, down to the end. With the first blade completed, I need to UV map it. I'll click on Freeze Transforms. Holding down the space bar, I'll go to UV Planar Mapping, and I'll be using planar mapping in the Y-axis. So I'll choose Y, I'll hit Apply, and then in the channel box, I'll make sure projection, width, and height are the same, and I'll make this 10. I'll return to the object mode for my geometry. With it selected, I'll click on the UV editor. In the UV editor, I'll right-click and choose UV Shell. I'll select the shell, hit W, and I'll move it outside of the checkerboard quadrant. Now we're going to duplicate it in the top viewport and rotate it 180 degrees. I'll click on Freeze Transform, I'll hit Command D, and then in the channel box, rotate Y would be 180, and we should see something like this. I'm just going to separate the two of them out a little bit because we're going to join them together using the bridge tool, and we'll do that through the perspective view. I'll hit 5 on the keyboard, and we'll start by combining these two pieces of geometry. With the geometry selected, both blades, I'll hold down the space bar and go to Mesh, and I'll choose Combine. Now I'll right-click and choose Face. I'll delete the inside faces of each of these, and then I'll right-click and choose Edge, and I'll select the edges of one side then the other. If I click on one and double-click, I get all 4. If I rotate around and Shift and double-click, on the other, all 4 of those are selected. You'll know they're selected when you see the brown. In the upper right-hand corner of the interface is a little tool with a hammer and a cube in it. When I click on it, there's a drop-down menu in the attributes with a number of tools. Down towards the bottom, under the Components tab, you'll see the word Bridge. And when you click on it, it'll join the geometry together as one. I'll go to my top view to refine the straightness of this piece here. And I'll zoom in to see what I've got so far, and it looks pretty good. In our perspective view, we should see something like this. And if I were to select this whole blade and go to my UV editor, you'll see it's reflected as just one blade. And that means that when we make the other two, they will all be in the same position, and they will all have the same collective texture. Now we're going to duplicate the propeller blades. In the top view, I'll hit Command D to duplicate. I'll freeze the transforms, and in Rotate Y in the channel box, I'll put 90, and I'll go to my perspective view, and I should see something like this. Next, we'll make the vertical cylinder shaft that will hold the blades on top of the drone body. Starting in the top view, holding on the space bar, create polygon primitives, cylinder, and I'll drag a bit of a circumference here, and return to my perspective view and give it some height. I'll go to one of my orthographic views, and I'll start by making it thinner, just like the legs of the drone maybe, and I'll start to give it some length. Now the length will be adjusted as we go. Once we get the articulating arm in, we'll decide how high it should be on the actual drone body, but we'll start to get it into position. I'll go to my top view, and I'll move that over so it's kind of centered inside the body of the drone. Now I want to put the blades there as well, so I'll marquee select both of them, and I'll hit W, and I'll bring them over as well. If I get close, I can actually use my V on the keyboard to snap it precisely over the very top of the cylinder. So now if I go into my perspective view, I should see something like this. Now I think I'll scale the blades down just a little bit. I'll hit Command G to group, I'll center the pivot, and I'll hit R on the keyboard, and I'll start to scale them in a little smaller. Before we go any further, we'll texture map the vertical cylinder by selecting it, and then right-clicking in the viewport, and down at the bottom I'll choose Assign Existing Material Drone. And I'm going to apply UV mapping to this as well. I'll use planar mapping with the Z-axis. Clicking on Freeze Transform, I'll hold down the space bar, I'll go to UV, planar mapping attributes, and I'll set it for Z and hit Apply. And then in the channel box, the projection width and height will be the same number. I'll make them 15. I'll return to my object mode, and now I'll go to my UV editor. In my UV editor, I'll move that UV map by right-clicking and choosing UV shell. I'll marquee select. I'll hit W, and I'll move that outside the corner with the checkerboard. Now we're going to introduce two other cylinders, and we're going to use the one we just created vertically. I'll go to my orthographic side or front view, and I'll hit Command D, and I'll start by scaling it. And I'm going to make it wider, and then I'll make it much shorter. I'd like a cylinder that would appear to be joining the props at the top, and then I'll duplicate it and I'll drag it down so it looks as if that cylinder is also joining it to the base polygon. I'm going to separate out the blades just a little bit, clicking on one and making it a little higher, and maybe selecting the other and putting it a little lower, just so there's some separation between the two. And I'll hit 5 on the keyboard, and we're looking at something like this so far. Now all we need to do is make the articulating arm. In the top view, I'll drag a footprint of a polygon cylinder, again very thin, and return to the perspective view, and I'll give it the length I'd like to give it. And I'll go to an orthographic view now. I'll pull it off to the side so it's not interfering with the blade above. Maybe I'll scale it a little bit shorter. This will also be changed as we start to put everything together with the IK kinematics and the skeleton. I want a duplicate of this. The arm will be comprised of a forearm and then the part that goes from elbow to shoulder. I'll hit Command D and W, and I'll drag the second cylinder up just above the first one. We'll make the joints with simple polygon spheres. Holding down the space bar, create polygon primitive sphere. I'll click and drag a sphere in at the top, and then I'll go to my top view to line it. And I'll drop the subdivisions down, 10. Now if I zoom in with F on the keyboard, I can hold down V, and I can snap it directly over the center of the cylinder below. Now in my front or side view, I should see something like this. We'll need two other spheres. Hitting W, then Command D, I'll drag one down in between the two cylinders. Command D, one last one at the bottom of the cylinder below. Now we're going to combine some of this geometry together. I'll start with the bottom half of the arm. I'll select the bottom sphere, the cylinder, and the sphere right above that. Holding down the space bar, we'll go to Mesh and Combine. I'll delete by type history, center the pivot, freeze transforms. Now we'll select the last sphere on top and the cylinder below that, and again we'll go to Mesh Combine, centering the pivot, delete by type history, freeze transforms. Now we're going to put the material on this so that it's part of the collective UV map. I'll start with one piece at a time, starting with the top. Holding down the space bar, I'll go to UVs, planar mapping, and I'm going to choose Z. That is the vertice that is perpendicular to the surface. I'll hit apply, and in the channel box, making sure projection width and height are both 15. I'll return to the object mode and select the piece below. Freeze transforms and apply, and projection width and height will also be 15. And I'll return to my object mode. I'll shift select both of them and then go to the UV editor. Just like the other elements, I want to make sure that I move them outside of the checkerboard pattern by right-clicking and choosing UV shell. I'll marquee select both of them, and I'll move them outside. While I have both components of the arm selected, I'll right-click and go down to Assign Existing Material and choose Drone. Now if I go to my UV editor with them selected and I introduce the checkerboard, I can see that both of those components are now outside the checkerboard. We have one less component to make, and that's the little kind of fingers that would hold on to an object that would be pulled out of that crater inside of Mars. And we'll start in this front view. Holding down the space bar, I'll go to Create Polygon Primitives Cube, and I'll drag a thin narrow polygon and go to the perspective window to give it some thickness. Now I want to have a right angle polygon extruded from this edge. To do that, I'll click on my Edge Loop tool, and in my perspective view I'll click and introduce an edge, and I'll hit W. Now I'm going to right click and choose Face and select the face on the lower inside, and I'll click on my Extrude tool and I'll pull out the bottom half of an L. I'll go to my orthographic view now to see what I have. I'll return to my object mode, and I think I'll probably get my vertices, and I'll just taper it at the top a little bit, and I'll return to my object mode. Now that we have that made, let's apply the material to it by right-clicking and choosing Assign Existing Material. And I'll freeze the transforms, delete the history, and center the pivot. And I'm going to relocate the pivot so that it's at the edge of the bottom part of the L. And that means we'll be able to articulate it and rotate it from that point. I'll now move it down, and I'll align it inside the sphere by using the orthographic views of my side and my top. Before I duplicate the geometry and flip it over, I need to apply the UV mapping to it. I'll freeze the transforms, hold down the space bar, I'll go to UV planar, and this will be on the z-axis as well. I'll hit apply, and in the channel box I'll reduce the projection width and height to about 15. I'll right click and choose object mode. I'll hit W, and now I'll duplicate it using duplicate special on its x-axis. I'll right click, choose edit, duplicate special, making sure that scale x-axis has a minus in front of the 1. I'll hit apply. There's one last element to make for the drone, and that's the solar panels that will go on either side of the drone body. Starting in the top view, I'll create a polygon cube. And the perspective view, I'll give it some thickness. We're going to use a cylinder to mount it to the side. I'm going to go to one of the side views. I'm using the side view where it's narrowest on this edge, and I'll go to Create Polygon Primitives, and this will be a cylinder, and I'll click and drag a circumference for it. Return to the perspective view, I'll give it some thickness. In the top view, I'll align these two. I'll make it thinner and maybe a little longer. Like the articulating arm, we're going to introduce a sphere at the bottom as a joint. Holding down the space bar, I'm going to Create Polygon Primitives, Sphere. I'll click and drag a sphere in the area. I'll reduce the subdivision to 10. I'll go to my perspective view and hit F on the keyboard to see what I have thus far. I need to align these. I'll go to an orthographic view to do so. And now I'll select the cylinder, and then I'll select the sphere, place it there. Going to my orthographic front view with the cylinder selected, or the sphere, I'll hit 4 on the keyboard, and now I'm going to align the sphere with the cylinder by holding V on the keyboard and snapping to the center of the cylinder. In my perspective view, I should be looking at something like this. We're going to map this geometry in its y-axis. I'll first shift select each of them and go to Mesh, Combine. Delete by type history, center the pivot, freeze transforms. I'll apply the material first by right-clicking and choosing Assign Existing Material, Drone. And then I will hold down my space bar, go to UVs, Planar, and I'll set it for Y, Apply. In the channel box, I'll make the projection width and height both 15. I'll return to my object mode, and with the geometry selected, I'll go to the UV editor. And now I'll move it outside the quadrant with the checkerboard by marquee selecting because it's more than one piece. Now if I return to my perspective view, I can now place the geometry where I'd like it to be in the context of the model. I'll go to my top view, I'll hit A on the keyboard, and I'll move the pivot of the solar panel first down to the sphere joint, and I'll move it into position on one of the sides of the drone body. I'll use one of my orthographic views to position the first one, and then in my top view I'll duplicate it. In my top view I'll click on Freeze Transforms, Command D. In this case I'll rotate it 180 degrees on the y-axis, and I'll move it over to the other side of the drone body. And we should have something like this.